The following is a presentation of the Healthcare Facilities Network. Hello, and welcome to the Healthcare Facilities Network. I'm your host, Peter Martin, Vice President of Business Development for Cref. Cref has offices in Boston, Massachusetts, Dallas, Texas, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and out in beautiful Utah. To learn more about Cref, go to cref.com. I'm happy this morning, or today, it always depends on when people watch these things, to be joined by my colleague, Dr. Lindsey Butler. Lindsey is the Vice President of Sustainability Solutions here at Cref. Lindsey, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Pete.
My pleasure. So there's a lot of sustainability, decarbonization. If you're in healthcare, really, if you're in any field, or if you're just paying attention, there's a huge focus on sustainability. So I'm happy to have Lindsey join us today. We're going to talk a little bit about demystifying sustainability. We're going to talk a little bit about getting started, some low-hanging fruit. We're going to talk about mistakes that Lindsey has seen firms or organizations make, way to avoid this. So really some building blocks of sustainability. But before we get into all that, Lindsey, you're a doctor now, you're well-educated. Tell us, we always start a lot of these facilities network with career paths. Was sustainability, was health, what was your career path that you wanted? And tell us a little bit about your background and how you got here.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So I guess I would put myself in a very fortunate group of people who get to sort of live out their childhood dream through their career. Mine was, if it wasn't going to be a professional soccer player, it was going to be environmentalist. I've been really passionate about issues around environmental science and environmental health since I was really little. My mom had
Okay, maybe you're gonna. How did you get passionate about that?
I don't know. I don't sort of remember, first like learning about issues around the environment. I think, there is a lot of evidence that, the more time kids have outside, the more likely they are to care about environmental stewardship. So maybe it was just getting thrown out to the backyard every day, but my mom tells a story of how when I was in preschool, she would go through my backpack at the end of the day, and it would just be filled with what she calls, in her Boston accent, a ton of garbage. But it was recyclables that weren't getting recycled at school. And so I would take them out of the trash and bring them home and recycle them at home. So I don't know. I've been an environmental steward from a very early age. I studied environmental science for my undergrad at Simmons, and I went into hazardous waste and emergency response right out of college, which is a great place to sort of see everything that's wrong with environmental policy and environmental stewardship. I worked in healthcare and hazardous waste and really was in the underbellies of hospitals, seeing the hazardous waste that's been
not glamorous,
generated, not glamorous,
no.
In a hazmat suit every day. And that really kind of got me thinking about how we as humans treat the planet, and then in turn how it treats us. Right, because it is a cycle, and the pollution that we create is the pollution that makes us sick. So you have this like really nasty cycle, and that is what inspired me to go back to school. So I got my master's and PhD in environmental health from Boston University, did a lot of work on drinking water. But it was really kind of thinking about, if I'm going to be rooting in for my PhD, I want to study something that is going to be, I never want to question, like, why am I studying this? And so climate change seemed to be, the thing that was going to be of utmost concern for our environmental health moving forward. And so I studied how climate change impacts the health of vulnerable populations, and how climate pollutants and extreme heat impact health through a lot of different pathways. And I just sort of felt like in academia that I was just describing a really bad problem. And I wanted to be a little bit more proactive and pragmatic in my career in working on solutions. So I started out in policy in Boston City Hall, got to be a part of the passing of Birdo 2.0, which is our emissions disclosure and reduction ordinance here in Boston. And then I was at Blue Cross Blue Shield, where I ran the Climate and Health Resilience Program to think about reducing the company's own environmental impact, while also thinking about what is the role of the payer in catalyzing health system decarbonization. And then I've been at Cref for a little over a year, helping our clients think about their sustainability strategies, projects that they can implement, projects that they can integrate into their capital projects to reduce some of their footprint and start working towards decarbonization.
Nice. Thank you for that. You used the term pragmatic, and I've told you this before, and I'll kind of say it again. So Lindsey has been with Cref, as you just said, a little bit over a year. I joined 3 months ago, so we taped this. We're taping. My kids always make fun of me when I say taping. Like, I guess taping.
The tape is rolling.
Yeah, I know. So we're recording this in August. I started in May, and one of the things when I was interviewing, I met with all our VPs of our 4 different service lines, and before I met Lindsey, I was wondering what I would encounter, because sustainability solutions, and we've talked about this, you see all the ends of the spectrum, right? Where people are just, it's come hell or high water, you got to be there, and you got to hit everything, no matter what the issues or the barriers are. And so I was very pleasantly surprised. Like, you're very pragmatic. You're a realist. You appreciate the challenges that organizations have, and you appreciate them, but you also know that there's a goal. So I've always found you're a realist, you're a pragmatist, you solve problems, but your feet are on the ground as you're doing it. Appreciate. You don't always find that, as you know.
Yeah, thanks so much, Pete. I guess I'm not a zealot. I'm really a pragmatist. I think I would say that I've developed that approach over time by seeing that the latter doesn't work. It's not effective, and I think when sustainability exists in an organization with the sole focus of reducing the environmental impact of the organization, it's not successful. From what I have seen. And I probably have some of the bumps and bruises from that siloed approach, where you have this expectation that everyone in the organization is equally invested in reducing environmental impact. It's just not, it's not true. And it's not an effective approach. I think sustainability is most effective when it is deeply integrated into your entire organization. So it's sort of as the sustainability leader, I don't want to know what I can do for you. I don't want to know what you can do for me. I want to know what I can do for you. Right. So when I started at Blue Cross, part of my onboarding was that I met with all of the senior leadership in the organization. And rather than go sort of drill into them about the importance of the organization decarbonizing, the importance of the payer in this, I went to all of them and said, tell me about your problems. Tell me about your business needs, right? If you're HR and you want to recruit young talent, we can use sustainability and decarbonization to do that. If you're in sales and you want to differentiate us, we can use how we think about decarbonization and resilience to do that. If you're in operations and you want to reduce operating costs, we can use decarbonization and resilience to do that. And so that's the approach you have to take. First, identify what are the problems in your organization, and then identify how sustainability can solve those problems.
Great approach. Do you think that you're, starting out hazardous waste in hospitals, in the bowels of the building, is just, I'd imagine some of that has to work into how you think about it now and how you interact with hospitals and systems, because you've been at the low, I'm using low point just in terms of
yes.
You've been in the bowels. Does that impact how you think about what you do?
100%. Because when you are a patient or even a clinician, you walk into that hospital to access your care or to do your great work taking care of your patients every day. Very few people get to see the behind the
Mm.
scenes, right? Get to see operationally and from an engineering and facilities perspective what is going on in that hospital to keep it going every day, 24/7, 365, and the expenses that go into keeping that hospital running, and how many competing priorities there are in that hospital every single day. And so I think, being behind the scenes, handling hazardous waste streams in healthcare facilities definitely informs how I approach sustainability for sure.
Cref provides strategic real estate solutions that enable organizations to get the most out of their physical infrastructure. At Cref, the difference is we're not just advisors, we're operators. Our expertise in strategic asset advisory, project management, regulatory preparedness, and finding operational efficiencies allows us to provide organizations with end-to-end visibility and insight into their real estate portfolios and physical assets. Please visit us at www.cref.com.
Yeah. You probably didn't realize it at the time, but what you were putting in the bank for later in your career.
Yeah, seriously, for sure.
So I do want to, start on kind of that first bucket, demystifying sustainability. But before we go there, you had mentioned, and I love your approach of, sitting with the leaders at Blue Cross, what can I do for you? Because automatically you're changing the paradigm of that relationship, right? It's not,
Yeah,
you're
and it's like, I
humanizing
think,
yourself.
yeah, and I think many sustainability leaders, we know what it's like to be like, ugh. People are like, oh my God, I have to meet with a sustainability person. Oh my God, I'm not printing double-sided, or my team is printing too much, or he or she, they're just gonna yell at me because, my department isn't meeting the sustainability goals they've set. Like, that is not my approach. I never want to be the thorn in your side. I want to work with you. And I think a lot of this comes from people's misunderstanding of sustainability.
Huh. Hold that thought for 1 second. When and I'm sure you've dealt with people like this before, when you deal with somebody though who's kind of standoffish, right? And you can read body language. You're a teacher as well. You're a professor at UMass Boston, so you know people and you can read body language. How do you, when you get somebody though who's either standoffish or not even hostile, but you know that you need to flip them a little bit? How do you deal with that type of a person or that type of an approach?
So I do what I like to say is just setting the table. I think we have this huge sort of crisis right now in sort of what I like to call scientific literacy. Because I've done this work in so many different arenas. I've done it in healthcare, I've done it in academia, I've done it in the public sector, the private sector. I've sort of noticed this thread across all of those arenas where sometimes you go in as a sustainability leader with an expectation that people have a baseline understanding and they don't have it. And so oftentimes that hesitancy or that sort of skepticism of me or of sustainability comes from the fact that no one has ever taken the time to set the table for you. I have seen so many leaders and decision makers who had to say like, hey, Lindsey, I'm sorry, but like, could you just tell me what a greenhouse gas is?
Mm,
Right. And so
yeah.
a lot of sustainability leaders, like we're so deeply trained, we're so entrenched in these dynamics that you forget that the people you're talking to don't have sometimes that baseline information. So if someone approaches these issues with skepticism or uncertainty or scrutiny, the first thing I want to do is just set the table for them. Like make sure that we are working with the same information. You know, do you understand a little bit about climate change? Do you understand why scientists know that we're having some of these changes? Do you understand the impacts? Do you understand how human activity fuels this stuff? Do you have any questions for
Mm,
me before we begin? Like just giving people moment to like ask a question, make sure the table is set, make sure everybody's got their fork and knife and spoon, and we're all just sort of working with the same baseline information. And I think the scientists like myself, sometimes we're not good at that. And so communication is so key. And just doing that quick literacy. And I think one of the reasons why we're not where we need to be on sustainability is because we have just hammered people with like, you need to change, the economy needs to change, you need to buy an EV, you need a heat pump in your house. We've slammed all of this on them without making sure that they understand why. Why would it be better to have an EV? Why should you install a heat pump? Why should you be advocating for things in your community? Like, we skipped a very important step, which is setting the table.
There's that building block, right? That building block that was skipped, the foundation for our facilities.
And I think that's why like some environmental leaders or advocates or professionals are sort of seen a little bit of like that like zealot extremist light, because we don't do a good job of just making sure everyone understands.
Well, I went to a presentation, it's about a year ago now, and it was just at an industry conference, and there was a number of different topics, and I just happened to pick a sustainability one because I wanted to just hear a little bit more. And I haven't forgotten this, the presenter, and it was in the healthcare environment, but the presenter got up there, and one of the first things that they said was, you're going to have people at the table who don't believe in what you're saying, and this is how you got to move them along. And right away, and she kind of framed it, they kind of framed it as an us versus them, turned me off right at the very beginning, and I said, listen, like you say, you're kind of all in it together, right? You need everybody rowing in the same direction and bring people along. But you're right, those little snippets can make a big impact, because we all form, rightly or wrongly, impressions pretty quickly.
Yeah, we do. And I will say, maybe in defense of that speaker you heard, I think this question of belief in climate change is something that really bothers me. Like, I try to discourage anyone from even using the term belief, because we believe in ideologies, right? Like, science isn't a belief system, it's a set of facts. Right? You don't say, I believe that gravity exists, or I don't believe that gravity exists, right? You drop something off the table and it's going to fall, and that's because gravity exists, right? So the belief in climate change is not an ideology. It's a set of facts, of scientific facts based on scientific observations that have been observed by a consensus of about 99.5% of scientists that study these topics, who are in agreement that the climate is changing. Yes, the climate has always changed, but it's now changing at an unprecedented rate, and that there's a direct correlation between human activity and these climatic changes, right? So that's a set of facts. It's not really like something to believe in or not. It's just something to observe.
Right. That's a nice distinction. So building block one, I don't know why I can't say that word. Demystifying sustainability. You've alluded to it a couple of times. What is it? What isn't? Somebody has a base, they don't even have that baseline understanding. Can you simplify it for them?
Sure. So I guess sustainability, what is it? What is it not? I'm going to actually start with what is it not, because it's often mischaracterized. So I think a lot of people think sustainability is just about planet. It's just about pollution. It's just about reducing your environmental impact. That's not true at all. Sustainability actually exists across multiple domains. It's the sustainability of the planet, yes, but it's more so the sustainability of people. It's the sustainability of the economy, right? So it's people, it's planet, it's profit. It's not just sustaining the planet. It's sustaining all of those things, right? So it's about, as human beings, what are our needs? As an economy, what are our needs? And as part of those two, we will need to sustain the planet and our natural resources. And in order to exist tomorrow, we will need to change our behaviors so that we are sustaining our planet and sustaining our natural resources. But I don't believe in this sort of, you do sustainability because you're a tree hugger. I'm not going to chain myself to that tree to tell you not to cut it down for the tree's sake. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stand in front of the tree with an analysis of what's going to happen to our atmosphere and the health of the community if you cut down that tree. So to me, it's not about the tree. It's about the people and the planet and the economy that are benefiting from all of the natural capital that that tree is providing us, namely protecting us from excess heat, absorbing excess carbon dioxide, giving us oxygen, preventing floods, all of the things that that tree is giving us as a community and as a population. That's why you can't cut down the tree. I'm not here for the tree's sake.
Yeah. So you're connecting to something, you're making those connections to something beyond that simple word or that simple deed.
Yeah, we're all connected, right? Like
Yeah.
we rely on natural capital to survive.
Yeah.
And it's not one or the other. Sustainability is not one or the other. It's everything in unison.
So along the lines of what sustainability is, how do you bring that? How do you transition the tree into the hospital? How do you take that integrated thought and translate, sustainability into the hospital environment?
Yeah, so I think part of the reason sustainability and the decarbonization of healthcare is resonating so much with clinicians right now is that we understand more and more that the environmental degradation in healthcare stands in direct opposition to what we aim to do in healthcare. Right? It almost, to not care about sustainability in healthcare almost goes against the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, right? And, as a health system, the health system is responsible for about 8.59% of domestic carbon emissions, the health system and its supply chain. And warming emissions aside, there's so many other ways in which the health system in a community is a huge source of pollution, right? In many of our communities, the health system is the largest employer, right? And then you have all of the employees commuting to work every day, and all the emissions associated with that. You have these supply chains that are so full of plastic, and you have the hazardous waste coming out of the hospital, and you have the huge amount of water that the hospital is using. So in many communities, the health system is the biggest polluter. And that pollution directly causes some of the illnesses that are showing up at that hospital.
Yeah.
So the health system is the ultimate example of this cyclical nature where we harm the environment and it in turn harms us. As the health system, we pollute our community and the community gets sick and shows up at our hospital.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the reason that sustainability resonates so much with clinicians. And then, again, going back to what is sustainability not, it is not always a cost. It is actually usually a benefit in terms of the operating costs of the hospital. There is so much money to be saved in enhancing the efficiency of your organization. And every one of those dollars can go back into patient care.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
I was
no,
gonna say, how do you deal with that? Because everybody, especially these days, it's just society wants immediacy, right? It's your payback has to be immediate. How do you deal with kind of that? I know there are some short-term paybacks which you can get really quickly, but how do you deal with that? The payback and the return on investment and the length of time it may take.
Yeah, that's a real tricky one. I mean, as we've talked about, there's so many competing priorities in
Yeah,
healthcare.
right.
And part of the reason I like doing this work in healthcare is like it's one of the most challenging sectors, I think, to do this work because the profit margins are so razor thin, if they even exist at all in a lot of our large health systems.
There's your pragmatic side coming in, which is right.
Yeah. So there are certain things that can bring a very quick ROI. For example, LED implementation. An LED light bulb compared to a traditional incandescent bulb can use 80 to 90% less energy, right? So some of the small, what I always call the low-hanging fruit, you can get a very quick ROI on some projects like that. And then some of them, there is going to be a longer ROI. Some of the things that are a little bit more difficult or expensive to implement upfront. But now we do have a lot of helpful things to help organizations navigate that, like commercial utility incentives, and a lot of great stuff from the IRA that help make those ROIs shorter and shorter and allow us to finance these things in these resource scarce healthcare settings.
Going back to that building block one, is there a simple, we know what, in your opinion, what sustainability is not. What is it then?
I would say sustainability is changing behaviors to ensure the longevity of people, planet, and profit.
It's a different definition. I like it. I like it.
Yeah.
Interesting. So we talked a little about, boy, it's kind of like a batter at the batter's box taking the first pitch and hitting it over the green monster. So we talked a little bit about the low-hanging fruit. You talked about LED lighting. What are some other simple, like if you're an organization, and I know that there's a lot of like smaller critical access hospitals, community-based hospitals, they might not be part of a system. They're kind of on their own. They're dealing with all those same challenges that everybody else is. If they're sitting there saying, oh my God, I got the 2030 date coming up and my organization is signed on, how do I get started? What do I do? How would you answer that?
Yeah, so I can give a couple of tips for how to get started. You can go to cref.com. Just
you.
kidding. A couple tips for how to get started. I want to give a couple of tips for how to get started, but I also want to touch on something that you mentioned with like the 2030 and my organization has signed on type of stress that a lot of people feel right now. Low-hanging fruit. Okay, so as I mentioned, lighting retrofits is a good one. That's one where you're going to get your ROI back pretty quickly. That's LEDs. Most places I think at this point have installed lighting sensors. So you're not lighting large parts of your hospital that are empty at that time, or rooms that are empty, patient care areas that are empty. There's a lot of things that we can do to the building envelope that I would consider some low-hanging fruit. But one of the most important things is you need to know what your emissions are. You need to get yourself in order because you can't manage what you don't measure. So an effort to characterize like what is the energy use intensity of your hospital, so that you know where you're starting from is really important. So I would say, you can use your utility bills to get at your scope 2 emissions and some of your scope 1. What is your vehicle fleet producing? So I would say getting everything measured up, at least for scope 1 and 2 emissions, right off the bat. And then another thing I would say is approach your commercial utility, because as ratepayers, we are all paying into programs to enhance energy efficiency and reduce the load on the energy system. And if we're paying into those programs, we should be able to access those funds, right? And I think hospitals in particular, because the EUI, the energy use intensity, which is the energy usage standardized by the square footage, because that's so high in hospitals, your commercial utility wants to work with you to reduce your energy load. And so approaching your commercial utility and saying, hey, what projects do you think we could implement to reduce our load, and how can we finance them together with our utility? And that's another thing that can help with that ROI issue that we have in healthcare, that we are working on such a thin margin that we don't have the resources for these sustainability projects. Work with your utility and approach them early on in your sustainability journey.
Or work with you.
Or work with me.
Is there a simple answer? If I were to ask you, you mentioned scope 1, scope 2, we didn't even talk about scope 3, but if somebody's sitting there, I've heard about scope 1, I've heard about scope 2. What does that mean for somebody starting on their journey? Those are pretty important areas. Is there a simple answer to scope 1, scope 2, and the not mentioned scope 3?
Okay, so I'm gonna give you a gross oversimplification.
Because people can always get more info. I mean, there's a lot of
Yes.
information out there.
So you can think of it as scope 1, you burn it. Scope 2, you buy it. Scope 3, you buy it or you sell it. Okay, so scope 1 is things that are combusting directly at your facility, right? So you have a vehicle fleet that your facility owns and it's burning gas. Those are part of your scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 is your indirect emissions from energy. So you are buying electricity from your commercial utility. It's coming in the form of electricity or natural gas. Those are your scope 2 emissions from electricity. Scope 3 is your supply chain, both up and down. So the things you buy, but also the emissions associated with the services or the goods that you sell.
A big one. I was just thinking as you were talking, I wonder if sometimes this problem or this sustainability can seem so vast that people kind of turn off.
100%.
Like just avoidance as opposed to just, I just can't even.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of evidence of this. One of my favorite climate scientists and communicators is a woman named Dr. Catherine Hayhow, and she actually writes about how a lot of what we need to do in terms of environmental stewardship, sustainability, standing up against the climate crisis is in like direct opposition with human psychology.
Yeah, I was just, when I was listening to you say that, that's kind of what I was thinking about.
Yeah, it's that like head in the
easier to turn it off.
ground. This is such a big problem. What could I possibly do to help it? This kind of nihilistic,
Yeah.
it's almost like, well, if the party's gonna end, I might as well enjoy the party as long as I can, type of mentality, right?
Yeah.
But what if you can keep the party going and actually make it more fun?
Good way to look at it.
That's how we need to look at it, that the things that we can do from a sustainability perspective bring so many co-benefits, right? It can improve air quality, it can save us money, it can protect us from extreme heat. Like there's so many great things that we could do. There's so much opportunity. And
Yeah.
if there's like one thing I would want people to take away from this conversation, particularly healthcare leaders, it's that sustainability is an incredible opportunity for your organization. It's an opportunity to enhance efficiency. It's an opportunity for cost savings operationally. It's an opportunity to make the community that you serve healthier and safer. We have to look at it as an opportunity, because if we don't, then we're all just like head in the sand. How can we do anything?
Yeah.
And that's just like not a way to continue on.
Right. So the final building block, and I'm talking to Dr. Lindsey Butler. Lindsey is the Vice President of Sustainability Solutions at Cref. Lindsey's my colleague. Lindsey, and I think you've touched on a little bit of it, but we talked about getting started, the low-hanging fruit. What are some mistakes that you see organizations making? And you hate to term them that, right? Because people are trying. But what are some missteps that you see or inefficiencies you see as people begin on this journey?
Yeah, it is a journey, and I think right now we see this huge wide spectrum of kind of where even very large health systems are on their sustainability journey. We have some incredible leaders like Kaiser and BMC, and then we have some folks who are just getting started on their journey, so a very wide spectrum. I think the major mistake that I see is that you can't just hire one person, and that's a sustainability professional, with an expectation that then sustainability is going to work. It can't just be, the Office of Sustainability over here that never gets invited to any of your other manager meetings or C-suite meetings. It can't be a siloed effort. And it can't, in that sustainability professional cannot take that approach of yelling at everyone all the time about being more sustainable. That is a major mistake. It has to be deeply integrated into the whole organization. And another thing, you mentioned there are probably going to be people listening to this podcast who their health system has signed on to the White House healthcare sector climate pledge, or the American Hospital Association, or they've made some commitment, they've made a commitment to their board, or they've made a commitment to their community or to the White House that they're going to decarbonize, that they're going to enhance their climate resilience. They've pledged, they've signed, but they have not put any resources into those efforts. They have not adapted their organizational strategies to include those efforts. They've just signed, and that's not effective.
Yeah.
You can't just sign. And many organizations, maybe they signed and then they went and hired one full-time sustainability professional who's their first full-time sustainability FTE. That's not effective. If you're going to sign on, you need to be ready to build these commitments into everything you do, and to do so in a way that benefits your overall organization, that advances your strategic mission, that advances your business goals, not harms them or contradicts them. And so I would say that's kind of the big mistake that we see, this like sign on, but don't change your organizational behaviors, don't resource sustainability. There's probably facilities directors that are like, hey, yeah, we signed on, they're hearing from their maybe chief operating officer. So we signed on to this pledge because all the other large health systems in our city signed on to this pledge, and you're in charge of sustainability now.
Yeah.
And the facilities director is like, what?
Right.
If you're that facilities director, call me.
Right. No, and they are out there. It's interesting. We got kind of up against a hard deadline, but we can always talk again. But you brought that up. That I did a show with a gentleman by the name of David Emery, and David he's a director at Intermountain Health in Utah. And we were talking about how to create work-life balance, but how to recruit facility employees in light of all the challenges out there. And David's trying to do some different stuff, which was really interesting. But we were talking about it, and you just mentioned it. Like, I think one of the challenges when you're working in hospitals and healthcare systems is everything is so ingrained. And sometimes those silos are so ingrained, and you have your clinicians and your doctors and the facilities folks are over here, and like breaking those organizational challenges down, which you were just describing, is a major problem for whatever you're trying to do organizationally, because you're going against maybe 20, 50 years of established thought, and it can be you.
Yeah, I would say, like sustainability, I think healthcare facilities leadership needs a rebrand. It needs a rebrand because it's so critical to like our entire health system nationwide and globally, and it is behind the scenes. And I, like you mentioned, I teach at UMass Boston, and I always tell my students, like, if you can't see it, you can't be it. like how many of my students are thinking about the
Oh,
role
yeah.
of
Yeah.
healthcare facilities leaders
Yep.
in decarbonizing the health system, right? These kids want green jobs. They want, well-paying, stable employment in a job that's going to help the planet. So many young people want that. And I think healthcare facilities leadership is one of those jobs. But if the healthcare facility space is not telling that story,
Yeah.
then these kids don't even know what goes in to healthcare operations and facilities management, and they don't consider it a green job, and it is a green job.
And that exactly is one of the reasons we created the Healthcare Facilities Network, is to promote that if you can't see it, you can't be it. That's great.
Mhm.
So Dr. Lindsey Butler, thank you for your time this morning. We'll have you back on again. Great
Sounds
breakdown.
good, Pete.
Excellent. This is Peter
Awesome.
Burton for the Healthcare Facilities Network and Cref. Learn more at cref.com. Lots of information about Lindsey's program, and search. You have a Becker's podcast that is
Mhm.
out. You can search for that. Lindsey just did that. So you're out there quite a bit. So if you can find plenty of info, or ask me or ask Lindsey.